Hi, my name is Tish, and in today's episode, we are going to discuss your vulva or your partner's vulva on steroids. The vagina undergoes significant changes, significant functional changes from one period to the next period. This is typically 28 days. It might be slightly more, it might be slightly less, but 28 days is the typical number of days for most women. This is often referred to as the menstrual cycle. So the time between bleeds, not just the days that you bleed for, which might be 3 days, it might be 5 days. The menstrual cycle includes everything that happens between bleeds. So in this episode, I want to share how these changes affect sexual function and libido in women, and what time of the month you can expect to experience greater levels of pleasure and satisfaction, and what you can expect to experience when conditions are suboptimal, and at what point of the menstrual cycle this occurs. So if you want to learn more about your physiology or your partner's physiology, and how you can use that physiology to leverage pleasure, then stick around. First, let's understand how these steroids behave and what effects they exert on the female body. So the menstrual cycle can be divided into two phases. Phase 1 is estrogen dominant. This is called the follicular phase. It spans from day 1 of your period to ovulation. Ovulation is the midway point between phase 1 and phase 2. So what happens at the start of the follicular phase, phase 1, is that we all know you get your menstrual cycle, and estrogen is relatively low at this point, but rises relatively quickly. You could be on day 3 of your period and feel like your energy is returning, and sometimes even your libido. Estrogen peaks at ovulation. It's at its highest during this part of your cycle, and this would be around day 14. So if we consider day 1 is your period, by day 7, it's cycling relatively high. So between day 7 and day 15, estrogen is at its highest. When ovulation hits around day 14, and it can be a few days either side of this, when ovulation hits, estrogen then begins to decline. So ovulation marks that midway point between phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 2 of the cycle is progesterone dominant. So estrogen is relatively low comparative to progesterone. This part of your phase lasts approximately 12 days. During the transitions from one phase to the next, both of these steroids, estrogen and progesterone, are relatively low. And the symptoms that are associated with both of these levels being relatively low are things like tiredness and fatigue. This part of your cycle is reflective of menopause. This is when these steroids stop cycling, which is quite worrying because estrogen is the master regulator of brain function. In fact, you have estrogen receptors all over the body. We're focusing on sexual function in this video. So when you feel tired or certain biological functions are not performing as efficiently as they did prior to ovulation, the symptoms might come up as poor gut health, brain fog, fatigue, vaginal dryness. If we're considering sexual function, it's likely that estrogen levels are low. It's important to note that this baseline begins to decline in the transitional years, which can begin in your 30s. The male equivalent would be testosterone. Testosterone doesn't behave like estrogen. It's a steroid that is replenished daily in men, and therefore men don't experience the highs and lows in emotional, physical, and mental, just fluctuations that women do. Before we dive into how these phases affect sexual function, do me a favor and hit the like button and subscribe for more content like this. So let's begin to talk about some of the functions of the vagina, of the vulva, and how these functions are affected with varying levels of estrogen and progesterone. The vaginal mucosa, and I mentioned this previously, plays a critical role in sexual function. The mucosa simply refers to the lining of the vagina. It is a mucous membrane that secretes mucus to maintain things like lubrication, pH balance, stretch capacity. This mucosa is rich in nutrients such as glucose and amino acids. During the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle, so that phase 1 of your cycle, those 2 weeks, so from your period to ovulation, estrogen is rising relatively quickly following menses, so following your bleed. As this happens, estrogen stimulates blood flow to the vaginal mucosa to enhance things like tissue perfusion and permeability, i.e. nutrient delivery. So here are 10 ways that estrogen enhances sexual function in no particular order. There's a greater production of nitric oxide in the vaginal tissues. Nitric oxide acts as a vasodilator, meaning it relaxes and dilates blood vessels, promoting blood flow, which, as I mentioned, is essential for nutrient delivery. It increases lubrication and also increases nerve signaling for things like sexual arousal and sensation. Estrogen also promotes the growth, development, and renewal of epithelial cells. These cells line the mucosa. They have various functions, and storing glycogen is one of them. These epithelial cells have a greater capacity to store glycogen during this follicular phase. Glycogen is a fuel source for your cells, so it's basically the cash that pays for your cells to do their jobs correctly. When estrogen levels are elevated, so mid-cycle, around ovulation, and that week leading to, and perhaps maybe a day or so after, the epithelial layer becomes plumper and more hydrated with glycogen. If you are someone that works out in the gym, you know the pump that you get after lifting, there's a higher abundance of lactobacilli. These help to maintain a healthy acidic environment. Those higher glycogen levels are correlated to a greater microbiota, which reduces the chance of things like a UTI or an infection. Estrogen increases cervical fluid. This is definitely something that you may have observed. This is a thin, clear, slippery type of fluid to support penetration. So it's unlike the fluid that your body produces during the second phase of the cycle, which is a lot more viscous. It's got more of a sticky, thick, creamy texture, which is not ideal for penetration. Collagen is a structural protein that provides strength and elasticity to the vaginal walls. You can find collagen in a lot of beauty products. The structural integrity and resilience of the vaginal tissues is increased during this time. If you experience pain with sex or experience some resistance, the tissues are more pliable for penetration during this time, if this is something that you are struggling with. The cervix is open. The cervix becomes softer and it rises into the vagina. As it rises up, it essentially creates space in the vagina. It is like the door. So when it rises, the vagina is open. This rises in the follicular phase. Estrogen supports proliferation of nerve endings. This enhances tactile pressure, sensitivity, sensations are just felt more acutely. Estrogen modulates serotonin and dopamine. When these levels rise, mood is enhanced, feelings of stress and anxiety are reduced, creating a more conducive environment for sexual desire. Estrogen essentially switches on sexual function in the same way that testosterone would in men, but contrary to testosterone, estrogen significantly declines along with sexual function in that second phase of your cycle. The drop in estrogen following ovulation results in a decrease in vaginal epithelial permeability and perfusion, meaning low blood flow, low nutrient delivery. There's a higher risk of infection, lower microbiota, the pH is higher, making the environment more susceptible to UTIs and infection. The epithelial layer is thinner. When glycogen levels are reduced, the vagina becomes thinner and more susceptible to damage. The lower glycogen synthase at this time reduces elasticity, which are likely to result in discomfort and maybe even pain during penetration. The consistency of cervical fluid is less conducive for penetration, but we know how we can force conditions with exogenous forms of lubrication. Watch my video on the slippery slope of lube. The cervix drops. I mentioned this as it drops, there's less space in the vagina. If you think about the canal, the vaginal canal, during the follicular phase, it's going to rise up and it's going to create more space. This is the opening. It's sort of rising up, and then what happens is it drops down, essentially closing the vagina. All of these things increase irritation and damage, most of which are usually treated with antibiotics. These antibiotics have negative effects on the gut microbiome and overall health. Antibiotics are not selective in their action. They kill both harmful and beneficial bacteria, which decrease microbial diversity. This disruption of gut microbiome leads to things like dysbiosis, which is an imbalance of microbial communities in the gut. Dysbiosis is correlated with gut disorders, metabolic disorders, autoimmune disease, and mental health conditions. So having sex when conditions are suboptimal can wreak havoc on your quality of life. So let's speak about progesterone. Progesterone increases in that second phase of your cycle. Progesterone has a much lower effect on sexual function, especially combined with low estrogen levels. And things like serotonin, dopamine, acetylcholine, which are all modulated by estrogen. This phase of the menstrual cycle, so post-ovulation and before your next period, estrogen levels remain comparatively low to progesterone. The combination of these levels, so high progesterone, low estrogen, have negative effects on physical, emotional, and mental health. Many biological functions are negatively affected, not just sexual function. Estrogen has strong influences on mood, stress, body temperature, temperature regulation, and sleep. It modulates metabolism in many cells. So when this is lowered, stress management is critical during this time. Many women experience severe bloating during this phase because gut motility is lowered. Emotional eating is heightened. Episodic depression is experienced, along with a greater negativity bias, which are all natural responses to low estrogen. So focus on things like self-care, maintaining boundaries against possible stresses, boundaries against people, places, and circumstances. Do things that nourish you rather than deplete you during a time when that steroid is low. You are essentially experiencing, during the luteal phase, so in that second half of your cycle, you are essentially experiencing a mini menopause followed by a mini pregnancy. And I say mini pregnancy because your body, what it's doing in that second phase, second part of your menstrual cycle, is it's building a home for an embryo, right? Progesterone is being produced in high amounts to thicken the lining of the endometrium. And then this is what you actually shed during menses, during your bleed, if that egg isn't fertilized. So forcing conditions when the body is undergoing energy extensive processes is unreasonable and, quite frankly, irresponsible. So comment down below, when do you have the best sex, solo or partnered? Is pleasure enhanced during certain phases of your cycle? How do you adapt your pleasure practices to meet the needs of your changing body? What self-care practices nourish you when you are feeling low? Did this video connect any dots for you? Let us know in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the comments.